Hello everyone, welcome to the third video in the GMing Daggerheart series. In this video, we will be talking about GM moves, fear, and pitfalls to avoid as a GM, so let's jump into it. First, let's talk about GM moves, examples of GM moves, and when you can do them. GM moves are simply the GM's influence on the story being told. That means GM moves are the adversaries attacking. They are the environments making it difficult to travel. They are the evil NPCs who make moves behind the scenes to sabotage the PC's plans. But that also means that GM moves are you narrating what everyone sees, giving them a first-grade puzzle that they won't figure out for hours, or acting as their favorite NPC, Fartbuckle. The list of GM moves you can make is on page 152, but Daggerheart classifying these as GM moves can be a little confusing, so I want to talk about each of them and what they mean. First, starting with showing how the world reacts, which is basically your narration of the story. What do they see, smell, hear, taste, feel? What are the consequences of them doing something? Asking a question and building an answer is when you ask a question to the player like, what item does your PC recognize in this store? How does this town remind you of your home? And other things. These questions can be used to engage players in the world-building process. Make an NPC act in accordance to their motives is just a fancy way of saying you are just acting as an NPC in that situation. Leaning on the character's goal to drive them to action is when you reveal something that the PCs are seeking while also perhaps introducing an obstacle that lies in the way. This drives the party to follow that lead, something like the BBEG revealing that they have captured the PC's mother and that the PCs must do something in exchange for her safety. Signaling an imminent off-screen threat goes hand in hand with your GMing narration. This can be anything like an explosion off in the distance, or a large storm on the sea, or an unexplainable earthquake. These are all things that point to something bigger happening and brings that feeling of the world is bigger than just us. Revealing an unwelcome truth or an unexpected danger is you reveal a betrayal or reveal the enemy has been there the whole time. This can also be when you begin a combat encounter or use a trap. Forcing the group to split up typically manifests as a trap or an environmental hazard that has caused the PCs to split up, or it's two urgent missions that need to be done at the same time, forcing the party to divide and conquer. Make a PC mark a stress as a consequence of their actions is pretty self-explanatory. If they barely make it out of a trap by succeeding with fear, maybe they still take a stress. Or perhaps something they are doing right now is reminding them of an awful memory. They'll mark a stress. Make a move that the characters don't see is when you are making moves behind the scenes. The BBEG just invaded the city a few days travel from where they are. The underground dam beneath the city just broke. Or maybe the party's information was just given to a powerful bounty hunter. This is just called the plot. Show the collateral damage is a move that you use when PCs make a huge move that undoubtedly has consequences. The fireball explosion deep within a cave begins the process of a cave-in. A battle on a mountaintop causes an avalanche toward the city far below, or attacking an archer who is aiming an arrow towards the queen, and the arrow is let loose. Clear a temporary condition or effect is typically something that you do during combat. If a PC causes an adversary to become restrained or another effect, you can spotlight that adversary to clear that condition. Shift the environment can be anything from a rope bridge beginning to fray to a building falling toward a PC after it was struck by a powerful spell. Spotlighting an adversary is typically used during combat to attack the PCs, but more about how that works when we talk about fear. Capture someone or something important can be anything from a PC's favorite weapon that they dropped or a powerful item that the PCs were racing to find. This can also be their favorite NPC or even the PC themselves, depending on the circumstances. Use a PC's backstory against them can be something like using the evil wizard that destroyed the PC's hometown and making them the BBEG for the next story arc. Or that PC could experience something very similar to a memory that they had, and going through this experience again now gives them a second chance to change how they faced it before. And finally, take away an opportunity permanently is a significant move that can take away a lead or a clue to where the story is leading. So this should only be used if there are a few other options for the PCs to move the story forward. This can be something like an enemy burning a map that shows the shortcut into their hideout, or killing a valuable NPC that had important information about weaknesses of the BBEG. So those are the GM moves that you can make. As you can see, they're basically anything that you can do as a GM to drive the story forward. So with that being said, let's talk about when you should make these GM moves. In my previous video, I talked about when you can make a GM move, and a few folks commented with this list on page 149, and they are absolutely right. I wanted to keep that video simple on the GM side of things because I knew I was going to be making this video for GMing to go more in depth on that. So with that, the book says that you can make a GM move when you spend a fear, when a player fails a roll, or when they roll with fear. But it also says that you can make a GM move whenever they do something that would have consequences, when they give you a golden opportunity, or when they look to you for what happens next. That means when they do something like jumping off of a cliff, then of course you are going to be dealing out some sweet, sweet consequences, even if you don't have the fear to do it. You're not going to just suspend reality and they become invincible until you get more fear. As for the golden opportunity, these are moments when they say, "He's right behind me, isn't he?" Well, of course he is. You're not going to spend a fear just to make that happen. It just does. Lastly, when they look at you for what happens next, well, yeah, duh. The story has to go on, so it's your turn to start describing the next conflict in the story or whatever else happens next. These last three rules are here to make sure you aren't limited by only the amount of fear that you have. However, try to get into the habit of doing bad things that negatively impact one or more PCs after a failed roll, a roll with fear, or by spending a fear, just so it doesn't seem like you're doing bad things for free and then hoarding your fear for a worse thing to come up later. Your players may only have a surface level understanding of what fear does, but they will be able to tell when you are abusing these rules. Speaking of fear, let's talk about what it is, how you get it, and how you spend it. First, you begin your campaign with an amount of fear equal to the number of PCs. Whenever a PC rolls with fear, you gain a fear, and additionally, whenever the PCs perform a rest, you would gain 1d4 fear on a short rest, and 1d4 plus the number of PCs in fear on a long rest. Fear carries over from session to session, however, you can only have a maximum of 12, which means you can use a d12 to keep track of how many fear you have. Or you can just use small tokens, or food, or whatever. Players should always know how much fear you have, so make sure to keep it visible, or at least tell the players whenever they ask how many you have. And now the most important part, how you can use it. I typically think of role-playing and exploring as a completely different thing than combat, something that has stuck with me since D&D. So I will say things like entering or exiting combat, but in reality, Daggerheart is meant to be played where combat is no different than when the players are exploring or talking. However, that being said, when entering combat, the PCs will naturally go first, unless you decide to spend a fear to start with the adversaries. This fear allows you to make a GM move, which is most likely going to be something like spotlighting an adversary. If you don't choose to start with the adversaries, the PCs will start, and whenever the PCs roll with fear or they fail a roll, the spotlight will then automatically shift over to you, and you get to make a free GM move, which can then spotlight an adversary or spotlight an environment move. Once you make your GM move, you can then spend another fear to make an additional GM move with an additional adversary. However, keep in mind that you can only spotlight one adversary once per spotlight shift unless the adversary has Relentless. When spotlighting adversaries, you can do their regular attack, have them run up to far or very far range, automatically clear a temporary condition or effect, or you can spend an additional fear to activate their fear feature, which is typically a big thing like big damage, targeting multiple PCs, or changing the battlefield. You can also spend a fear to add an adversary's experience to a roll. These are typically from +2 to +5, depending on which tier the adversary is. These can also be added to the adversary's difficulty when a PC attacks or does something if the experience applies. The last thing that you can do with fear is anything that makes sense. Spend a fear to add a new adversary to the scene. Spend a fear to activate a powerful spell, deal massive damage, or start a ritual. Spend a fear for the environment to exert a strong negative effect on the party, or anything else that seems comparable to any of the things that I've said so far. Fear, in its essence, is a strong pushback on the PCs. Some general tips for spending fear. I really like the idea of the enemies acting first, so spend a fear to spotlight a couple adversaries at the start or very early in the combat is one of my favorite things. However, make sure to have a few fear to do big things after the PCs do big things, keeping that balance of battle swaying back and forth. If you're full on fear, make a few moves at the start of combat and then wait to see what the PCs do. If they start rolling really well without any rolls with fear, then use a fear to stop them and start attacking with the adversaries again. As far as how many you should spend at a time, there is a table on page 155 that shows you different scene severities and how many fear to spend for them. But to be honest, I think you should just always base it off of how the battle is going or how the story has been going so far. If you feel like this is an important time to use fear, great, go all out, only holding back when things are looking a little too dire for the PCs. If you feel like you've been using a lot of fear lately and the players need a break, hold back and let them breathe for a little. Make sure to write down each PC's evasion, HP, and stress so you can keep track of where everyone is in the battle, and as it's going on, you're not absolutely obliterating just one of them. And then also, every table is different, so you as the GM for your table will have a better idea on how to play and how to use fear against your table as time goes on. All right, GM moves and how to use them, done. Let's talk about some other GM mechanics that you'll need to know. First, let's talk about player roles and when you should ask for them. Daggerheart is very focused on the storytelling aspect of TTRPGs, which means that your players may not be rolling as often as other TTRPGs. The best way to think of this is if a normal person was able to do it, then adventurers, literal heroes, would be able to do it. So no roll is needed. The basics for requesting rolls is a player says they want their PC to do something cool. You figure out which trait best fits the action and then request that type of action roll. And then depending on the result, you narrate the success, the failure, or consequences of that roll. And speaking of traits, you can also find a handy dandy table on pages 158 and 159 that describe types of actions that will be under each trait and the difficulty tiers, but more on setting difficulty later. Another reason to keep them from rolling all the time is that hope and fear are gained through your players rolling. They have a higher chance of rolling with hope than they do rolling with fear, which means that if you're having them roll often, they will be restocking their resources quickly, which leads to big moves being available more often and less conflict when fighting against stronger adversaries. They'll constantly have enough hope to gain back HP, and that just defeats the purpose of combats entirely. With that being said, when you do ask for them to roll, be sure to give advantage when you want to highlight smart moves from planning or showcasing a PC having specialized skill or knowledge about something that they're doing, and similarly give a PC disadvantage on a roll if they are doing something while being tied up, or maybe their previous roll was a failure with fear, which when setting the difficulty for those rolls, here's a guideline that is found on page 157. 5 is very easy. Honestly, if it's that low, you shouldn't even be asking for a roll. 10 is easy. Again, I don't even think that should be a roll. 15 is average, 20 is hard, 25 is very hard, and 30 is nearly impossible. When a player rolls a failure with fear or a success with hope, they are typically self-explanatory in what happens. It's exactly what they didn't want or exactly what they wanted. However, succeeding with fear and failing with hope are the two gray areas that are sometimes difficult to figure out for rolls. For failures with hope, if the PC would take damage from a full failure, a failure with fear, perhaps they only take a stress. If a failure with fear would have resulted in the item shattering, perhaps the failure with hope means that it's only cracks on that item. Or maybe a failure with fear would mean the shopkeep becomes hostile to the party, but a failure with hope means they refuse to speak to that PC, but the rest of the party can still have a chance to recover. Also, if you truly don't know what to do, you can always just delay the bad thing from happening and cash it in at a dramatic moment in the story, or just go with the bad result anyway. It's really not that big of a deal. For a success with fear, a full success could have been something like fully translating a book, but a success with fear is only partial translation. Or maybe the NPC gives most of the information, but keeps the secret to themselves. Or maybe the PC can see the glow of a nearby fire, but can't see the bandits that encircle it. Again, you can always postpone the cost of this roll to a later, more dramatic moment in the story, or just fucking throw it out and take the fear. And if you're truly stumped and don't want to delay the effect, ask the players what they think. Typically, the wild stuff that they come up with is way worse than things that you'll ever come up with on your own. Outside of one player making a roll, there are also times when the whole group must make a finesse roll to stay hidden, or an instinct roll to see if they can hear something approaching. For these group action rolls, you set a difficulty, and everyone rolls with one person helming that roll. For each success a supporting player makes, they will then increase the helming player's roll result by 1. For each failure the supporting players make, they will then decrease the helming player's result by 1. Each of the rolls beside the helming roll are reaction rolls, which means they don't gain hope, you don't gain fear, and crits do not clear a stress. They are simply meant to add 1 or subtract 1 from the helming roll. So I suggest setting the difficulty before everyone rolls, because then they know whether they succeeded or they failed, rather than just telling all of the results and you have to figure it out. After getting the results of the helming roll, you add and subtract the other results, and then you get your final result to compare to the difficulty. If this result ends with a failure, you may want to add and incorporate failures of supporting players in the result, and vice versa if it's a success. The helming player isn't the only one doing something, so make sure to include the other PCs in the narration of what happens. All right, that's the results of rolls. Now let's talk about countdowns. Personally, I don't use countdowns often because I usually just run on vibes of the game. That being said, these can be an extremely useful tool for adding tension to battles, rescuing an NPC, or preventing a bomb from exploding, etc. Standard countdowns tick down each time a player makes an action roll, and then when it reaches 0, the countdown effect triggers immediately after the action that triggered it. Short countdowns will typically be from 2 to 4, while longer ones will typically be from 5 and up. Dynamic countdowns tick down based on the result the players roll. These typically have a starting number of 5 to 10 and can be used for things like PCs trying to break through a stone wall that doesn't have any HP stats, or this could be used to gauge the PC's escape from a collapsing building. If this is a progress countdown, like for the wall, the countdown would tick down by 3 for a critical success, 2 for a success with hope, 1 for a success with fear, and no advancement for failures. Similarly, if this is a consequence countdown, like escaping a collapsing building, it will tick down by 3 for failures with fear, 2 for failures with hope, 1 for a success with fear, and no ticks for successes with hope, and a critical success. Next are the advanced countdowns. The first example of this is the randomized starting value countdown. I spoke about this in my previous video about adversaries that could use these countdowns. These are typically seen in a monster stat block on an especially deadly attack that the monster may have, like a dragon's breath weapon. For this, once you use that ability, you will then roll the die that the countdown asks for and proceed as if it were a standard countdown. Once it triggers, you may use that ability again for whatever cost it has, and then once you use it, you roll it and the countdown starts again. A loop countdown is similar to the randomized starting value countdown, but this one is always the same. Once it triggers, you can use that action again, and once you do, it starts back up at the same number as before. Finally, the increasing or decreasing countdown. These are written as increasing 8, where the countdown has a starting value of 8, and when it ticks down and triggers, the countdown then begins again at 9, and then it goes down, and then it starts at 10, and so on and so forth. Alternatively, you may see decreasing 5, where once the countdown triggers, it decreases to the starting value of 4, and then it triggers to the starting value of 3, etc. These are used for major events like a cave collapse as they are rushing outside, or a ship sinking. Chase countdowns are used for chase scenes. You'll take 2 die, 1 for the pursuer and 1 for the escapee. Whoever the pursuer is, they will start at the highest value that the die has, while the escapee starts at a lower value depending on the lead that they have. If they have a small lead, they have 1 less. If they have a decent lead, they'll start with 3 less. And if they have a substantial lead, they'll start with 5 less. This can be used for short distances or if the party is running from an evil army over the span of miles. Regardless of whether the players are the pursuers or the escapees, the results of their actions directly relate to the ticks for each countdown. For each success with hope, they will tick down only their own countdown once. For each success with fear, they will tick down both countdowns once. And for each failure, regardless of hope or fear, they will tick down only the other countdown once. Then finally, we have long-term countdowns that are used over the span of a few sessions and usually start anywhere from 4 to 12. Since these span over multiple sessions, make sure to keep track of how many ticks they've gotten since the very beginning. These tick down once per short rest and twice per long rest. Examples of these can be found on page 164. Outside of countdowns, there are a few optional rules that you can play for your game, like fate rules, which is basically the same thing as saying roll a d20 in D&D. These are rules that it's just to see if it happens or not. Tell them to roll 1d12 and on some result, something happens. This can be especially useful when PCs are competing in something and you don't want them to gain a whole bunch of hope or you gain a whole bunch of fear. So just have them roll 1d12. There's no hope or fear to be had from that. Have them add their ability of their choice and see who wins. For falling from tall heights, you can deal damage to them. For a fall from very close range, you roll 1d10 plus 3 physical damage. For close range, it's 1d20 plus 5 physical damage. And far or very far, deal 1d100 plus 15 physical damage, or death if it's too high. And when colliding with a wall, object, or other creature at a dangerous speed, that would deal 1d20 plus 5 direct physical damage. Some general combat rules to keep in mind: adversaries don't make action rolls, they just automatically do things without those rolls. However, if they do something that you would require a PC to roll for, make sure that you're using their full action and don't allow them to do anything else like attack or something else. Another thing, when a spell or other effect says group, that means an amount of people clustered within very close range of a point that you choose. Also, if a spell or other effect doesn't have a specific end, then that means that the effect lasts until the PC, adversary, or you, the GM, want it to end. For any effects that stack, the person who gains the effect can choose which one comes first. So if something gives hope and then something takes hope, you can choose to gain the hope and then use that hope for that other feature. When spending those resources, you can only use features that affect a roll once. If there are other effects that don't affect a roll, like the Guardian's Hope feature to spend 3 hope to clear 2 armor slots, then they can do that twice if they have 6 hope to spend, because it doesn't affect a roll. While in combat, cover can also be used for PCs and adversaries. When someone goes behind cover, any attack beyond that cover has disadvantage on that attack. For weapons, a PC can only carry an additional 2 weapons at a time outside of a primary and a secondary if they have it. When switching weapons, the PC must mark a stress to quickly swap during combat. I wouldn't count this as an action since there's no roll involved. However, switching weapons outside of combat, no stress is marked. For armor, if it's outside of combat, switching that is fine, but it is impossible to do during combat. If a PC does switch armor, they will take the new armor slots of that armor and the new thresholds will be added, but make sure to add their level to the base thresholds as well as any other bonuses that they may have. For underwater fighting, a PC has disadvantage on attacks, and if they can't breathe underwater, you can use a countdown that ticks down by every action that PC takes. If the action results in a failures with hope or a success with fear, tick it down 1 additional time, or a failure with fear will then tick it down an additional 2 times. At the end of that countdown, the PC will begin taking stress for each action they take until they resurface. There's also optional mechanics for PvP, so if there ever is a story-relevant reason for conflict between PCs, first make sure that everyone has resounding consent to this. From my experience, most PvPs have not ended well, and that's because there wasn't an in-depth discussion about it beforehand, or there were misunderstandings of how it would all play out. So if everyone is absolutely okay with PvP, then here's how it works. Attacks are normal. Duality dice, add modifiers, compare it to evasion, yada yada. For any other type of action, one player rolls an action roll, while the defending player rolls a reaction roll. The defending player's reaction roll result sets the difficulty for the attacking player to succeed against. Simple as that. While exploring, darkness can also sometimes affect the game. To reflect that, the GM can increase the difficulty of things unless that PC
I have dark vision!
Yes, if the PC has dark vision. Now let's talk about downtime. When the adventuring day is done, the PCs will rest. While doing this, some PCs may work on a project. To keep track of progress, Daggerheart uses countdowns for players to know just how long they have before the end of their project. Each time a PC takes the work on project rest move, perhaps that countdown ticks down like a standard countdown, or you incorporate a roll like a dynamic countdown, but that's how you will deal with those projects. Whenever there's a lot of travel over long periods of time and you have a montage, don't worry about focusing on each short and long rest while doing that. Here's how you can handle it. Discuss with your players what they want their PCs to accomplish during that time and allow them to perform any required roles. If the players want to focus on their project, consider allowing them to automatically finish it, or have them roll on a success, they finish it, and on a failure, they still have some progress that they need to do to finish it. Then, since this is over a long period of time, allow your PCs to just regain all HP, stress, armor slots, and hope, and then you gain 1d6 fear per PC. When it comes to leveling up in Daggerheart, there's no experience points, which means you have to do milestone leveling. You can do this after a especially important session, like a battle with the BBEG, at the end of a mystery investigation, or as the party is finally leaving a town they've been in for a while. If you're running a short campaign, you may also want to have them level up every other session, or whenever feels right, depending on the length of the campaign that you're running. All right, with all of that aside, let's talk about avoid death once again, because people have opinions about it. First, many folks think that I'm some terrible person for even considering killing an unconscious character. Y'all, that is the story that I want to tell. Y'all can have different games with your own rules. Chill the fuck out. Second, I said in my previous video, talk to your players. They have just as much say in this as you do. See what they think about the avoid death move, and whether they want unconscious players as legitimate targets during the battle or not. If not, then don't do it. Third, this is how me and the Bitten cast are dealing with it. If a PC goes down and chooses avoid death, a countdown of 4 begins. Each action the PCs take ticks down the countdown. When it hits 0, I can spend 3 fear to attack that PC, killing them. There are a few other folks who commented suggestions on my first video, so go check those out if you don't like my homebrew rule, or let me know what you think about it and how you would incorporate something like that at your table if your players are cool with it. Jesus fucking Christ. On the topic of death, when a PC dies, you have the fun job of figuring out how the hell to add that new PC to the story. Perhaps the new PC has important information about the bandit operation. Maybe they were a spy and just barely escaped after being found out. Maybe they were sent by a wealthy benefactor to see the party succeed in their mission. The book also has a list of other provocative questions that can help you think of ways to bake a new PC into the story on page 183. The way you choose to do this is going to vary drastically depending on where the PCs are in the world and what they're doing. But if all else fails, just remember, this is a game. Don't keep your friends out of the game just because the story doesn't have a good place for them to enter. Just add them and figure it out later or never. It really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. And if you and the players seriously can't figure it out, poof, a new person appears. All right. Mechanics aside, let's talk about what it takes to be a good GM and how to avoid being a bad one. First, let's talk about the difference between being an antagonistic GM and a collaborative GM. The GM is everything around the PCs, the environment, the NPCs they interact with, the enemies they face, the conflict in the story, even during the worst of moments where you are playing as the powerful, hateful enemy of the PCs, you should never, ever, ever be the enemy to the players. This means you should never punish a player through affecting their PC in the story. Instead, you or other players that have issues with a player follow the plan that you created during your session 0, set up a time where all of you can get together to talk about about these grievances in a friendly, non-judgmental way, or get rid of the problem player if the grievances are too severe. Antagonistic GMs constantly use extremely powerful NPCs that are way out of the PC's level just to slap the shit out of them over and over again. Whereas a collaborative GM may have 1, maybe 2 battles with the BBEG or their minions when PCs are underleveled to show how powerful those BBEGs are and how much the PCs need to grow in order to defeat them, which is a great storytelling tool. Collaborative GMs also support their players throughout the game by actively helping them overcome conflicts both in the story and out of game, like reminding the player about a piece of information they may have forgotten, but their character would absolutely remember, or telling them the potential consequences of a risky move, or giving grace and patience to a player who may be forgetful or haven't yet fully grasped the rules and their PC's abilities yet. Antagonistic GMs find joy in making their players figure things out on their own, even when there is a simple solution that can save everyone a whole lot of time. Collaborative GMs talk with their players about exciting plans they have for their PC's story and plans they have for the rest of the campaign. Antagonistic GMs constantly talk about how exciting it would be to kill your character. Collaborative GMs highlight the badassery of the PCs whenever possible. Antagonistic GMs constantly nullify PC's abilities and are constantly sabotaging the player's plans, making it useless to even make a plan in the first place. Collaborative GMs know that the PCs are the main characters of the story and make sure to spotlight the players as much as possible. Antagonistic GMs tell their players to be more succinct in their role-playing because it's not interesting to them, and then hog the spotlight to show how awesome of a GM they are, or they may only spotlight certain people because they like them more than others. When players are absolutely decimating a combat encounter you created, a collaborative GM will learn from this encounter and may, on the fly, increase the health of the enemies only slightly, or may increase their attack and damage modifiers only slightly to make the combat encounter only slightly more challenging. Antagonistic GMs will overcompensate by constantly faking roll results and making up rules on the spot to stop players from doing any cool things for the rest of the encounter. I promise, when you make shit up on the spot, it is extremely obvious, even to the players that don't know the rules. So just be transparent if things aren't going how you thought they would go, and trust your players to make the story good anyway. And on the opposite side of that coin, when a GM accidentally puts too much gas on an encounter, a collaborative GM may hold back on their tactics, perhaps not spend any more fear so that the players can finally catch up, or maybe they fudge some rolls here and there. Did he just say to cheat? Yes, but tactfully and responsibly. If rolling a critical hit on a PC would ruin the game, then absolutely you should cheat and fudge that roll. However, if you do make that judgment call, never ever ever tell the players, because that would absolutely break the trust that they have in you as the GM, which can soil their hard-won battles thinking that they only succeeded because you cheated for them. Now, assuming you're here watching this video in good faith to become a better GM, and you're doing your best to be a collaborative GM, then congratulations, you've graduated to being a great GM. It's truly that easy. Supporting and rooting for your players is really all it takes, because that means that you will do whatever it takes to make sure that everyone is having fun, because that is the sole and only point to TTRPGs. All right. Congrats on the graduation. Let's continue with more general tips. Something that every GM should absolutely abide to is the rule of cool. Remember, the mechanics are here to bolster the story, but if they get in the way, bend them or even throw them out to make sure your players feel cool doing cool shit. Furthermore, let your players make their characters look cool and do cool things that are for thematic reasons that still follow the mechanics of the game. For example, in Bitten, one of my players has arcane gauntlets, but he also wanted to have a buster sword because a punch wizard with a buster sword is cool as hell. There is already a mechanic for switching weapons by marking a stress, but thematically, we just made it so that the arcane gauntlets themselves turn into that buster sword. Mechanically, it's the same thing as marking a stress and swapping out for another weapon, but thematically, it is cool as hell, and he marks a stress and smacks his gauntlets together, and a buster sword comes flying out of them. So just let them do cool shit. Another example that I often see fumbled by GMs is when a PC is extremely agile and the player says that they want to do a backflip over one of the other PCs to stab the adversary in the back. Just let them do it. Mechanically, it would be the exact same thing as if they went around them to stab, so just let them do cool shit. When a player tries to push a little more than the mechanics allow, then have them roll for it. Like they want to run on a wall to far distance. Since running far distances typically require a roll, then just do that. And on that same note, when a player fails a roll, don't make their PCs look like a fucking idiot. Remember, these are literal heroes of the story. A caveat to that would be, if the players want their PCs to look like a fucking idiot, and that's the vibe of the game, then obviously go for that. That being said, sometimes the players come up with some of the most batshit crazy ideas that doesn't fit the narrative. So GMing is a mixture of yes and, yes but, no but, and a flat out no. Yes and is when the players say something cool and you're able to add more to it. This is the most common type of reaction you'll have with your players, and a good example of this is when you ask a player how their PC kills an adversary. They get to narrate how they do it, and then you yes and by building upon that and creating an incredible moment of victory for everyone. Yes, but is an interesting reaction when a player asks to do something crazy that would have consequences. A player may ask to switch places with an NPC as they take a killing blow. You may answer yes, but you will immediately have to do a death move. Then leave it to the player to decide if it's worth it or not. No but is when the player asks to do something too far out of the scope of the narrative, but you still want them to be able to achieve their goal. A fairy player may ask if they can carry one of the other PCs and fly around, but if that fairy isn't strong, you may say something like no, but you can make a strength action roll to see if you can help them jump higher or for longer distances. However, sometimes the request a player makes is just too far out of the narrative and a simple no has to be the answer. An example of this in the world of Bitten could be a player asking to stop the process of turning into a blighter after a bite. The answer has to be no. Another general tip is when you're making puzzles and obstacles, don't ever just have one concrete answer that will work. Have an idea of what the answer is, but keep things flexible for when the PCs come up with something close or even better than what you had anticipated. Then you can easily pivot to make them right. And on that note, when players openly give you ideas for the campaign, try to add them in. Allowing your players to have figured out the story is a great way to make your players feel like they're starting to get the plot, or that they're really great at predicting the story. Another thing I see GMs fumble often is when you are running your game, make sure to give your players enough time to have in-character conversations. Some GMs feel that they need to move on to the next exciting thing instead of allowing them to roleplay. But I'm here to tell you that you can just sit back and watch. Then when the conversation comes to a natural close or the players look to you, then bring them to that next exciting moment. But allow your players to explore RPing as their character, because that's when the magic happens. That being said, make sure to skip on the other moments where things are dragging on, like for combat. If there are 2 enemies left and the PCs are clearly going to win, have the enemies run away, surrender, or just cut the battle altogether and ask how the PCs finish the fight. I did this in my Daggerheart campaign at the end of the tough battle that they had where there was only a couple blighters left and the PCs were basically able to escape at that time. So I ended the combat early and moved straight to the long rest instead of asking what the last 4 or 5 actions would have been to kill the rest of the blighters. Outside of that, something that a lot of GMs struggle with is railroading the story. Do not force your players to do something that they do not want to do, or else you'll end up with something like this. Awful moment. Being unwilling to bend the story to what the players want to do will inevitably end with the players' disinterest in the story. If they feel like they don't have full control of their decisions, then why should they be interested? This doesn't mean that you shouldn't give them bad choices like a catch-22 situation where either direction would be disaster, because they still have a choice in those situations as long as it makes sense in the story. Railroading means when the players have one and only one decision that they don't want to do and you're forcing them to do it. This often happens when players do something that you weren't expecting and you want to put them back on the main plot line, so you'll do everything in your power to force them back onto it. Well, I am here to tell you they will do unexpected things, and they will do them often, so avoid railroading by following the rule of 3 that I talked about in the previous video. Make 3 clues, 3 NPCs, 3 locations, etc. Having extra plot devices will help prevent those moments where your players do something and you don't have anything as backup to keep the plotline going in the direction that your players are going. However, despite everything I just said, there will always be a spiritual railroad that the players will be following, that we know as the plot. This is more like a train station where there are dozens of tracks that all lead to the same place, the end of the story. How they get there is completely up to the players, but in the end, the result is the same. So, your job is to be that gentle hand pushing them forward in the story by laying all the clues in front of them, and then you hold on for dear life as you do your best to move everything around as your players make the most unexpected decisions, causing you to move locations from one side of town to right in front of them because they missed the giant billboard clue that you left them in the previous scene. As you can see, GMing is the delicate balance between helicopter parenting and hands-off parenting. But all jokes aside, one of the last things that I will say is that mistakes are going to happen. We all do it, so the best thing to do is just embrace it. When there's a point in the story that you realize that you made a mistake or you can't smooth a mistake over as the story goes on, just be honest with your players. Retcon it and continue playing. Or if you have to, go back to that moment and just do it over. In the grand scheme of things, it's not going to be that big of a deal. And just be honest with your players. Let them know if you're feeling nervous about GMing or if you're unsure as to where the story is going. Bring them in on that process and work with them to create a cool story together. All right, that is all I have for GMing Daggerheart. However, if you're looking for more general GMing tips, Matt Colville's How to DM series is amazing. He gives incredible insight on how to make maps interesting, how to use monsters, how to write stories, and how to be an overall better storyteller. Some of this is more focused on D&D, but that is where I started, and I highly recommend it to anyone that wants to jump into the GM seat. So I'll have a link to that playlist in the doobly-doo. Anyway, that is pretty much it. I have covered a lot in this video and the previous 2 videos, so thank you all so much for making it to the end. It truly means the world to me. If you have any requests for other things I should talk about or things you might want me to go more in depth about, let me know in the comments. I'd love to keep making content that's helpful for folks. And if you want to see how I GM Daggerheart, go check out my actual play Bitten here on my channel. We've gotten a lot of great positive feedback about it, so I think you'll enjoy it. Think Last of Us, Walking Dead, and 28 Days Later in a fantasy setting. Anyway, thank you all again. Make sure to subscribe, do the things, all that stuff. I appreciate you being here. I will see you all in the next video.